Good afternoon. I'm Darwin S. Lazaro, your today's presenter about enterprise architecture, developing the EA management and transition plan. Let's review about what is an enterprise architecture, like kagaya ng mga nauna. So, i-review lang natin. Enterprise architecture is a well-defined practice for conducting enterprise analysis, design, and planning and implementation using a comprehensive approach at all times for the successful development and execution of strategies. Enterprise architecture applies architecture principles and practices to guide organization through the business, information, process, and technology changes necessary to execute their strategies. These practices utilize the various aspect of an enterprise to identify, motivate, and achieve these changes. Practitioner of enterprise architecture, inter- enterprise architects are responsible for performing the analysis of the business structures and processes, and are often called upon to draw conclusion for the information collected to address the goals of enterprise architecture, which are effectiveness, efficiency, agility, and continuity of complex business operation. It is also a conceptual blueprint that defines the structure and operation of organization. The intent of enterprise architecture is to determine how an organization can effectively achieve its current and future objectives. Enterprise architecture involves the practice of analyzing, planning, designing, and eventual implementing of analysis of an enterprise. Okay, let's have some question. What makes a good enterprise architecture? An excellent enterprise architecture strategy is future oriented. It is designed using the latest business process innovations, information system, technologies, and organizational structures. Goals for enterprise architecture include creating reusable and discoverable assets for business. The goal of enterprise architecture is to create a unified IT environment, which is standardized hardware and software system uh, across the firm or all of the firm business units, with tight symbolic links to business side of the organizations. Uh, and its strategy, of course. More specifically, the goals are to promote alignment, standardization, reuse of existing IT assets, and the sharing of common methods for project management and software development across the organizations. The end result is theoretically that is the enterprise architecture that will make it IT cheaper, more strategic, and more responsive. The importance of enterprise architecture. Enterprise architecture will help multiple departments in the business understand the broader business model and articulate challenges and business risk. Because of this, enterprise architecture has an important role in unifying and coordinating departmental processes across the organizations. Okay, being able to access and understand business capability should also help individuals identify gaps in their business, and from there they can make more informed decisions. So makikita na natin yung role mismo dito ni enterprise architecture. to unify and coordinating departmental process. Okay, let's talk about its purpose and goals. Okay, the main goals of enterprise architecture may be to create a map or blueprint of such structures and operations of the organization. This blueprint should include information such as map of IT assets and business processes. Okay. The other common goals include promoting team alignment and standardization. This can be done in part of unifying environments across teams and organizations. Guidance is normally based on organizations' business requirements. Benefits of enterprise architectures. Possible advantage of having an enterprise architecture include: number one is improve decision making. So improve adaptability to changing demands or market conditions. Elimination of inefficient and redundant processes. Optimization of the use of organizational assets. Minimization of employee turnover. Support organization changes for redesign and reorganization. Make it easier to evaluate architecture again long-term goals. Okay. Can give views of IT architectures to those outside of IT. Baga, better understanding daw. Okay. Can help with the unification of the processes in IT. Can help simplify finance teams and facilitate collaboration with the project manager. What are the components of enterprise architecture? So, enterprise architecture is the methodology by which an organization plans and arranges IT infrastructures. Components of EAR: analysis, design, planning, and implementations. Okay. The purpose of enterprise architecture is to create a map of IT assets and business processes, and a set of governance principles that drive on an ongoing decisions about business strategy and how it can be expressed through IT. There are many different suggested frameworks to develop an enterprise architecture. However, the most frameworks contain four basic domains as follows. Okay? Una-una, yun nga, yung business architecture. Documents that outlines the company most important business processes. Second, the information architecture identifies where important blocks of informations, such as customer record, are kept on, and how one typically accesses them. And followed by the application system architecture, a map of the relationship of software application to one another. Uh, Lastly is the infrastructure technology architecture, a blueprint for the gamut of hardware, storage system, and networks. The business architecture is the most critical, but also the most difficult to implement, which is according to industry practitioner. Dito makikita natin yung pinaka pyramid, ano niya nasa top ang business, followed by data application and technology. Okay. What is an EA framework? An architecture framework establishes a common practice for creating, inter- interpreting, analysis, and using architecture description, which is a view and viewpoints, within a particular domain of application or stakeholder community. It is a structure for the content of an enterprise architecture description according to the IEEE 1471 definitions. Utilizing an enterprise architecture framework streamlines the process for creating and maintaining architectures at all layers and enables an organization to leverage the value of architecture best practices. Example ng mga architectures are enterprise architectures, functional business segment architectures, cross-cutting technology domain architectures, and solution architectures. Okay. An enterprise architecture frameworks provides a collection of best practices, standards, tools, processes, and templates to assist in the creation of enterprise architectures and architectures of various scope. Okay. Enterprise architecture frameworks typically include, okay, common vocabulary, models, and taxonomy, processes, principle, strategies, and tools, uh, reference architectures and models, prescriptive guidance, which are the EA processes, architecture content, implementation, roadmap, and governance. Catalog of architecture delivers and artifacts. Enterprise architecture content meta models. Okay. Enterprise architecture models and methodologies. Enterprise architecture are typically implemented as frameworks. There are many different frameworks, and some will be a better fit than others when it comes to any one organization. For example, a framework focused on consistency and relationship with various parts of an overarching enterprise would be more helpful to larger organizations with many moving parts compared to small ones. In this case, a framework like the Unified Architecture Framework may work. Okay, let's discuss briefly lang yung major enterprise architecture frameworks. Okay, there is no shortage of EA frameworks in the IT industry. Sackman was the first to formalize the concept and publish a framework. Since then, other EA frameworks had been published and are used by many organizations. They attempt to address the basic challenge of accessing, aligning, and organizing business objectives with technical requirements and strategies such as SACMAN framework, the Open Group Architecture Framework, or the TOGAP or the NAP, the DODAP, the MODAP, and etc. Each framework processes different strengths and weaknesses. Okay, let's discuss about the SACMAN framework or for the enterprise architecture. Uh, this covers six architectural points as well as six primary stakeholders that aid in defining and standardizing IT architecture components. The Unified Architecture Framework or the UAF, which is a complex but flexible enterprise architecture framework suitable for military and government software developments, as well as use in commercial businesses. It implemented as a UML profile. The Okay, let's discuss about the agile enterprise architecture, which ito na, which focuses on organization around a flexible, extended collection of the structures and processes that can grow. It can become an important part to agile software delivery and the Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework, or PEAF. Okay, PEAP, yeah, PEAP, which is a reference model that has introduced in since 1996 for IT effectiveness. It was designed for the US government but can be used in private companies as well. Okay, other frameworks include the Open Group Architecture Framework, the European Space Agency Architectural Framework, the SAP Enterprise Architecture Framework, or the Ministry of Defense Architecture Framework. Enterprise Management Plan. Okay. The EA Management Plan documents the enterprise's performance gaps, resource requirements, plan solution, and sequencing plan, and a summary of the current and future architecture. The plan also describes the EA governance process, the implementation methodology, and the documentation framework. It is a living document that is updated at regular intervals to provide clear vision control for changes in current and future views of EA components and artifacts throughout the framework. The EA management plan should be achieved in the online EA repository to support easy access to the information and to promote the linkage of EA to another IT management processes. Recommendations for the creation of a sequence plan. In conventional project management, the creation of a sequence plan is an important planning task. The following recommendations are given. Plan the project realistically and together with the project participants. Okay. Define objectives if necessary, subdivided into mandatory, desired, and optional goals. Divide the project into phases such as preparation, implementation, delivery, and project completion, and define corresponding milestone. Agree on the person responsible for individual work, packages, and use buffers. Check, adjust, and update the sequence plans on a regular basis. In addition to using sequence plans in project management, any form of agenda, which is tabular, formal, graphical, or freehand, describe a sequence. Yun yung may listing, then or graph, or yung from here to yung pathway, yun yan. Para yun yung pinaka-sequence niya. In the common approach, there is one enterprise roadmap for the overall enterprise and one transition plan, two views for each architecture project. Ayan yung enterprise roadmap, transition plan, current views, future views. The roadmap, plan, and views provide a picture of the architecture in terms of what exists currently, what is planned for the future, and what the transition paths will be in all six domains. Okay. Enterprise architecture roadmap. An enterprise architecture roadmap is the strategic blueprint that communicates how a company's IT plans will help the organization achieve its business objectives. These roadmaps can be deployed for initiatives such as communicating a change management plan, for example, to move the company to new tools or technology, or the implementing the digital transformation of a legacy, the offline process, addressing all IT process needed to support company-wide compliance with new and changing data protection regulation. uh, how to build an enterprise architecture roadmap. So, makita natin may 5 dito. So, isa dyan determine your current state, define your desired state, conduct a gap analysis, prioritize your actionable items, find the best sequence, and lastly, meron pa yan, develop and publish the roadmap. Okay. In step 1, siyempre, determine your current state. Okay. If you want to develop a roadmap for an IT implementation or tech migration or another major company initiative, you first need to get a clear understanding of where your organization stands today in relation to that objectives. Okay, this means asking and tracking down the correct answer to questions such as what are what are our functional needs to successfully execute on this IT plan? What business and technical assets do we have to do, do we have that can help us accomplish these big objectives? Okay, which assets we are lacking, and can we find alternatives for them? And what disruption, if any, will this implementation create across the organizations? Are there ways to mitigate or minimize those disruption? Those are the questions, okay? And step number 2 is define your desired state. Okay. Next, you'll want to develop and write down a clear picture of what success with this enterprise architecture plan will look like. Your desired future state, that means, for example, deciding which metric to focus on, what improvement especially you'll be hoping to see from with each, such as, is it increase profitability, is it reduce cost, or even entry into new markets. Okay, third naman is conduct a gap analysis. Now that you've articulated clearly where your company is and where you want to take it, you can begin identifying the specific areas your team will need to improve to reach your desired state. This item will likely make up the main themes or epics on your enterprise architecture roadmap. The actionable items you come up with during this stage in your roadmap develop could be include any or all of the four main architecture domains: the business information or the data, or and application and technology. Okay, sa step 4 naman, prioritize your actionable items. Okay, Siyempre, you now want to review all the actions you identified in the previous steps and order them accordingly to priority. You can use any number of prioritization models, but one we often turn to is the cost versus benefit approach, which you can use right in the product plan roadmap application to objectively measure the relative value of your list of actionable items. Siyempre, the last dito sa graph natin, pero may isa pa yan, find the best sequence. At this point naman, you'll have to you will have determined the main actionable items needed to complete your planned new architecture implementation. And you will have ordered those key items in terms of their relative priority. A critical next step is to determine the most effective sequence to begin executing on these items. You won't necessarily want to tackle them in order of priority without considering other factors first. For example, uh, are there dependencies that could affect the order of the team's work? Oh, will rolling out some of these changes have a better effect on company adoption, buying in, and moral than others? And of course, lastly, the develop and publish the roadmap. Finally, you will now be ready to turn that well thought out strategically sequence list of major action steps into an enterprise architecture roadmap. Okay. Okay. This final step address the importance of distilling your plan into a high-level strategic summary rather than a tedious list of tasks and details, which is what most roadmap look like initially. The second is the transition plan. Few enterprise architecture changes are simple enough to be implemented without a transition plan. Transition planning develops a strategy and plan for effectively managing the transition from the current environment to the environment described by the enterprise architecture. The plan identifies the sequence of the activities that must be completed in order to implement the future architecture. The establishment of a governance structure is also defined in the transition plan. The governance structure supports the transition plan and establishes the chain of command for implementation decisions. This governing body will provide guidance on the interpretation of the enterprise architectures, manage communication, and ensure consistent use of the enterprise architecture. The governance structure also ensures that the enterprise architecture is revisited and refined through subsequent transition phases. Current views. The current view of the EA is intended to show the IT resources that are presently active in the enterprise's IT operating environment. Okay. This is also known as the as-is view of the EA. As is. Okay. Depending on the amount of prior EA planning, these IT resources may or may not be aligned with the enterprise's strategic goals and business services. If little EA planning has occurred, then a significant amount of duplication in function may be present. As is shown in the figure on the next page, current views of the EA provide an enterprise with documentation, existing strategic goals, business services, information flows, IT system services, and technology infrastructure, as well as the common thread areas of security, standard, and workforce planning. Documentation of the current EA is important to an enterprise because it provides a set of baseline reference information or artifacts for planning and decision making. Also, by completing the documentation of current EA components at all levels of the framework, a view of the enterprise emerges that reveals association, dependencies, and performance gaps between the enterprise's business requirements and current capabilities. The future view of the EA documents the IT resources that will be active in the operating environment several years in the future. This is also known as the to be view of the EA as opposed to the as is view that documents the current IT resource. Depending on the amount of EA planning that has occurred previously in the enterprise, future IT resources may or may not be aligned with the enterprise strategic goals and business services. If if little EA planning has occurred, then a significant amount of duplication in function may be present, and the future views of the EA should show how that duplication will be eliminated. Okay, as future views shown in the figure, itong may shade na block na nakapaligid sa kanya, uh, the development of future EA views is important to an enterprise because it supports resource planning and decision making. Also, by completing the documentation of the future EA at all levels of the framework, a view of the potential future enterprise emerge that reveals changes in priorities, processes, and resources. These serve to promote communication about these potential changes throughout the enterprises. In developing future EA, each level of the framework is documented with artifacts to show components that are approved for implementation or are in the idea planning stages. The potential changes to existing EA components include new or updated strategic goals and initiatives, business services, information flows, system, support application, and networks. Initiatives that are in very early stages of considerations can be left out of future views until they have backing from sponsors, strong business cases, and viable technical solutions. This avoids cluttering future EA views with initiative and updates that have little change of being implemented, and which over time will detract from perceived value of EA as an alternative reference for planning and decision making. Okay, developing an enterprise architecture management plan. The development of an EA management plan, which is the document that describes how an enterprise will manage the transition of its current processes and resources to those which will be needed in the future. This transition from the current EA to the future EA is an ongoing activity as new resources are implemented and therefore become part of the current EA. The purpose of configuration management and version control are also discussed, along with the need to provide a sequence for the implementation projects. So, dito as figure naman, makikita natin nasa gitna ay yung architecture management plan. Okay. The enterprise EA is in continual transition as IT implementation and upgrade projects are completed. Large and mid-sized enterprises often have many IT projects underway at any given time, which requires an overarching level of coordination, prioritization, and oversight. As is shown in the figure, the EA management plan provides this coordination and support oversight for changes to the enterprise EA between the current and future views. Home architecture analogy. The EA management plan is like the architect project plan, which summarizes the work and shows the design, approach, time frame, and sequencing of work for the remodeling of a home. Ayan yung sample, di ba? EA transition and the management thereof are documented in an EA management plan, which has several sections as is shown in the example formatted provided in the figure on the next page. In this figure, we have sample example ng enterprise architecture management plan format. Okay. I-describe ko isa-isa from part 1 to EA program management to part 4 EA glossary and reference. Okay. As part 1, nandito yung as program management. Dito naman merong EA as an management program support policy development, decision making, and the effectiveness or the efficient use of resources. The EA program management section documents the activities associated with administering EA as an ongoing program. Okay. Sa governance and principles sa 1.1, these sections documents the way that policy and decision making will occur within the EA program. And 1.2, the support for strategies and business, these sections emphasize that one of the main purpose of the EA program is to support and improve the enterprise strategic and business planning, as well as to identify performance gaps that EA components can be closed. Okay. As dito naman tayo sa 1.3, the roles and responsibilities. Okay. This section this section documents the roles that stakeholders in the EA program will pay and what the responsibilities associated with those roles will be. Okay. Sa program budget, okay, dito naman yung this section documents the budget for EA program by fiscal year and over the total life cycle so that the total cost of ownership is identified. Okay. The program performance measures ay naman sa 1.5, this section documents how the effectiveness and efficiency of the EA program will be measured. There are two types of measures, the outcome and the output. Okay. Under the current architecture summary, one of the purpose of the EA management plan is to show an overview of the linkage between the current EA components and the product at each level of the EA 3 cube EA cube framework. In this way, the present role of IT within the enterprise is better understood and can be further analyzed from either a top-down or bottom-up perspective. The objective of this part of the EA management plan is not to duplicate the extensive documentation described in yung mga previous lecture natin, but to provide an integrated view of how components and artifacts works in support of each other. This also stage for part 3 of the EA management plan, which discuss future changes in EA components and artifacts to achieve improved performance or efficiency. Okay, the following are the example on how current EA components and artifacts can be described at each level of the AQ framework. So, dito naman, strategic goals and initiative. Ito yung this section identifies how EA program and specific EA component support the attainment of the enterprise strategic goals and initiatives. So, yung 2.2 business service and information flows, ito naman yung section identifies and emphasize the role of EA plays in supporting business process analysis and improvement, as well as identifying and optimizing information flows within and between these processes. Okay. The third, the system and applications. Ito naman, this section identifies how current EA components and artifacts at the system and application level of the EA framework support the information flows that are required in the LOBS throughout the enterprise. Okay. The technology structure, this section discuss naman the voice data and the voice data and video EA components and artifacts that makes up the technology infrastructure level of the EAQ framework. Followed by the 2.5, the security. This section discuss generally approach to IT security at all levels of the EA framework. So, punta naman tayo sa standards. 2.6 is standards. The standard section documents the technical standard reference model or the TSRM, okay, which provide EA standard for voice data and video and IT security that are used during EA component development. Okay. So sa 2.7 naman, workforce requirements, this section describe the approach to IT workforce planning and training that enterprise uses in human capital management. Punta naman tayo dito kay future architecture summary. Okay. Sa future architecture summary naman, yung future operating scenarios. In this section, the future operating scenarios are presented along with a narrative description of the purpose of the scenarios and the spectrum of operating environments that the scenario respond to. Okay. For example, three scenarios are presented with an opening narrative that explain that they are represents. Okay, first scenario is continuing with the status quo. The second scenario is an aggressive business strategy in a good market environment. The third is a defense business strategy during market downturn. Okay. In the 3.2 about the planning assumption, okay, the planning assumption from the scenarios are further discussed in terms of what they mean to the priorities of the enterprise as it implements the future EA. Okay. The updating current future views, the 3.3 under part 3 is the documentation of plan changes in process and resources is what creates the future views of the EA at all levels of the framework. 3.4 is about the sequencing plan. The sequencing plan is a section of the EA management plan documents the tasks, milestone, and the time frame of the implementing new era components and artifacts. And last dito kay part 3 na future architecture summary is the configuration management. The EA configuration management or the CM section of the EA management plan serve to support the sub-process by which changes to the EA are managed and the standard in the TSRM are applied. Lastly, the part 4, the under glossary and reference. This part of management plan is where the glossary of EA terms is provided along with an acronym list. There should also be biographical list of reference books and articles that might uh, provide additional background or the help of readers' understanding of the EA management plan. Because the EA is still an emerging area of professional practice. The acronym list and glossary are helpful in creating a common set of terms and definition for use throughout the enterprise. So it's basically all of this is document, diba? Ito naman, i-show ko yung mga samples ng EA roles and responsibility matrix. Yan, naka-matrix yan, column by, ano yan eh. Yung bawat, may mga nakalagay sa bawat row. Yan. Ito naman ang mapping EA components to strategical goals or initiative. Naka-state din dyan. As well as the mapping EA component line business and informational flows. Line of business, sales, manufacturer administration, and yung mga value ng keys, process, information flows, and supporting AI components. Ito naman sa example of technical understanding reference model. Ito yung sample table. Yan. Example AI sequencing diagram. Makita mo paliit, parang battle yung hanggang sa dulo may matitira na lang is pa konti. Ayan, sequencing diagram. This is as the sample request change request form. Ito yung format as sample lang. And that concludes my video presentation. Thank you